My name's Emily St. John Mandel. I'm calling in from my home office in Brooklyn. My husband and I were in the middle of a home renovation when the pandemic came. So the project was stalled and it just restarted. And that's why I'm in a room with all of my blazers. I've written 5 novels. The most recent one, and the one I'm talking about today, is The Glass Hotel, which just came out in late March. It's a really hard novel to try to summarize in any kind of a concise way. It's kind of a strange and complicated book. My original idea with it was that I was going to write about a Ponzi scheme. Every character in this book is fictional, but I was fascinated by the Madoff Ponzi scheme, which of course imploded in 2008. And I was interested in writing about a similar crime and the fallout from that, the people caught up in it. But I was also interested in writing a ghost story and also found myself putting in this whole container shipping element. So the result is a book that it's just really hard to summarize. It's a white collar crime story that's also a ghost story. I guess that's how I'd put it. Something that I've heard a number of times over the years is this idea that my work occupies a territory that's somewhere at the intersection of real life and the surreal, I guess you could call it. And that's something that I've definitely heard in connection with The Glass Hotel, but also in my previous novel, Station 11, which was concerned with an apocalyptic pandemic. I don't know that I can point to one single reason why that territory fascinates me. The life I'm living sometimes doesn't seem that plausible to me, given my background. I was born and raised in Canada, and I trained as a dancer. That was my post-secondary education. I've never had any writing training or been to a workshop or anything like that. So I think I sometimes find myself thinking that the life I'm actually living is a little bit implausible. Just given where I'm. Maybe it's that. I think also writers tend to have an interest in the strangeness of the world. That's something that I would say is a feature of a lot of my favorite works of fiction. It's just this sort of lens on the surreal, or this idea that the world itself is a little bit unfathomable. And maybe if you think that way, you're more drawn to being a fiction writer. I guess it's kind of a chicken or egg question, but yeah, that's what comes to mind for that one. Just at this particular moment in history, it's hard for me to connect with the idea of American ingenuity, I guess, in kind of a broad, countrywide basis, because our response to the pandemic has been fairly catastrophic. It didn't have to be this bad. At the same time, though, if you look at that through an individual lens, how have individual Americans, individual people living in the United States, how have we found a way to adapt and somehow do our jobs in this incredibly chaotic, dangerous environment with no childcare and no school? I think there's been incredible ingenuity just in our day to day lives. And it's a little sad that that's been forced on us in a way, but it is there. I've certainly seen and experienced the way parents in particular have just been able to do amazing things, that it's been possible for us to do our jobs with no childcare for our children. That's been a major thing for me. So yeah, that's where my mind goes at the moment with that idea of American ingenuity. Launching a book during a pandemic is a really strange experience. It's also much less awful than I thought it would be. I had a 25 city tour on the calendar, and there are difficulties in that. I have a young child, and it's hard to be away from her for that long. But a wonderful thing about a tour is getting to connect with people in different places where I might not otherwise have the opportunity to go. So when it became clear that travel was no longer a thing and the tour was canceled, I was kind of anticipating this sort of weird, creepy world of Zoom calls. And it was so much less creepy than I thought it would be. Especially in the early days of lockdown, where we really were not seeing anybody. And that's only changed slightly now. We're in a quarantine bubble with one other family and a childcare worker. But in the early days, it was just the three of us, me, my husband, and my daughter. And I love them so much, but there's also something to be said for talking to people who don't live in your home. So, I really came to value those nightly Zoom events in the first couple of weeks after publication when I was doing events almost every night. And I was surprised by how real those connections felt. Even though it is just digital, that it was still connecting with people who love books, and that was really meaningful to me. I think also, just in a practical sense, I do have to acknowledge a lot of privilege here in launching the Glass Hotel. This pandemic has been catastrophic for debut writers or for writers from small presses who don't have the built-in audience of having previously published to Station 11 and who really depend on hand selling from booksellers and people coming across their books on tables. So, the my launch went really well, I would say, for the Glass Hotel, but I was also really lucky. I'm so grateful that it was this book and not, say, one of my first four novels. So, yeah, I think in general it was really hard for a lot of writers. So, something that comes up a lot in questions about process when I do interviews is this sort of weird fact, which is that I don't write from an outline. And you know, they the books I write are somewhat complex in terms of structure. There are lots of point of views, so multiple perspectives, multiple timelines, these kind of weird nonlinear structures that just move all over the place. And a part of that, I think, comes out of not having written from an outline. That gives me a certain freedom to just kind of wing it and see where it goes. That also gives me an incredibly messy first draft. So for me, the entire novel really comes together in revisions. I just go over it again and again and again until it's hopefully somewhat coherent. And because I do so many revisions, often the chapter that I thought would be the first chapter of the book ends up being somewhere completely different. So with the Glass Hotel, my original idea was that it was going to be very narrowly focused around this white collar crime, this Ponzi scheme. And really, the point of fascination for me with Madoff's crime, the Ponzi scheme that this crime is based on, was thinking about his office staff. I think something that's not widely known about Madoff is that about six or seven of his staffers went to prison. And at the time that story broke, I had a really great day job. I was a part time administrative assistant at a cancer research lab at the Rockefeller University in New York. I really liked my coworkers. And what I found myself thinking about was just the camaraderie that you have with any group of people working together, that sense of shared mission. Now, imagine how much wilder and more intense that would be if you were showing up at work on Monday morning to perpetuate a massive crime. So that really just caught my imagination, that idea. Who are these people? What kind of stories would they have to tell themselves to sleep at night or meet their family's eyes across the dinner table? So, the first chapter of the book that I wrote was the chapter that, after several rounds of revisions, eventually became chapter 10. And that's actually my favorite chapter in the book. It's told from the perspective of the Ponzi staffers. It begins with, "We had crossed a line." That's my go to for readings these days when I do events for the book. So, I would say my favorite character in the novel is Vincent. And where that character came from was that pretty early on, as I was thinking about what this book was going to be, I realized that if you're writing about a massive financial crime, by default, you're writing about money, which is a really interesting topic to me, in part because we don't really talk about it. It's this weird kind of taboo, talking about class and what it really means to have money. So that became one of the organizing principles of the book. I decided early on that every section of the book, and the different sections are told from different points of view, was going to involve the ideatedness, whether it was explicitly a ghost or something a little bit more subtle, and involve the idea of money. And, something I like to emphasize with this book is that all of the characters are fictional. So this isn't Madoff's real family, or actually Madoff, or actually his wife, or investors. So that gave me a lot of freedom in imagining who are the people around the Ponzi schemer, the central criminal. And I find myself kind of interested in the phenomenon of trophy wives. These very beautiful women who are making a very explicit trade. And I think it's a really kind of interesting economic phenomenon. And I liked the idea of a trophy wife who was kind of secretly a genius with a rich artistic life. I felt like that wasn't a character I'd really encountered that much. So came from. And she was pretty much there from the very beginning. And I liked the idea of her coming from a working class background as I did, so that she had this almost anthropological feeling when she came into money later on in her life. And in the book, she thinks of it as the kingdom of money. It's like this country that she gets to live in for a few years. Libraries have played a huge role in my life. I don't know if I would have been a writer without libraries. So when I was a kid, my family had no money, but both my parents love books, which I understand to be the most incredibly privileged kind of childhood. So, we had a lot of books in the house, but then we also went to the library once a week and checked out the maximum number of books, which I want to say was about 14. It was like this huge stack of books we teeter out to the car with. So libraries were hugely important to me when I was a kid and a teenager. And I remember getting to the point of familiarity with the collection. I'd be going down the shelf, read that, read that, read that, read that. And, when I look back at the books that had the biggest impact for me as a reader and also as a writer, a lot of them were library books. So, yeah, I would say that libraries have been incredibly important in my life. I have a few ideas that I'm happy to share. One is actually not from me. It's from Neil Gaiman, who's a writer whose work I really respect. And I remember him saying once, I think it was on social media, he said, finish what you start. And I think there's a lot to that because it's really easy to start anything. You can write a really great first sentence and then that turns into a great couple of pages. And then you kind of get bored. You're not sure how to work through the plot problems and the characters feel a bit flat. So you set it aside and start something else. And I think Gaiman's point was that it's by working through those problems that you become a better writer. So I think that's an important idea. Um, Another idea that I've personally found really helpful is to train yourself to write anywhere, under any circumstances. It's easy to get a little bit precious about your writing environment. Oh, I have to be in my home office with my particular pen or whatever it is. But if you can write for half an hour at Starbucks on your lunch break, you'll get a lot more done than if you have to have a really specific time and place to do it. And then, kind of parallel to that, this might sound a little bit awful, but it was really helpful to me. You need to be a little bit ruthless with your time. There will never be enough time to write. Either you're balancing your writing with a day job, or you're balancing your writing with your childcare responsibilities, or doing all three at once. And what that's meant for me personally is that I'm not going to your poetry reading unless I really want to. I have plans that night, and my acquaintances don't need to know that I have to not go to their poetry reading and stay home and write. Then along the same lines, and this is really a pre-pandemic kind of thought. I've barely seen anybody in months. But, if I have a couple of coffee dates on the calendar with friends, I'm not going to schedule a third. I need that time. So, yeah, being a little bit ruthless with how you spend your time. And then this last idea is actually not related to writing, it's related to publishing, which is a totally different thing. Don't assume that the publishing world is closed to you. I think there's this really damaging idea that you have to get an MFA or know the right people or live in Brooklyn or go to the right parties or whatever it is. And I just don't think that's true. Certainly none of those things were true for me when I started writing. My first agent found me in her slush pile. The publishing world is full of people whose job is to find really good new writing. So, yeah, I guess those are my main pieces of advice. I guess if I were to leave you with one final thought for these times, I'm calling in from New York City, and it was bad here at the height of the pandemic. Constant ambulance sirens, and just this, not to be too melodramatic about it, but this feeling of death just kind of right outside your door. So I guess what I would say is, we're all really tired of quarantine, and it's a drag, and we long to see the people we love. But Please wear your mask. Don't hang out indoors with people who aren't in your quarantine bubble. Yeah, not to get all epidemiological on you, but I think those are the words I'd leave with.